And so, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and so I am also working." For this reason, they tried to all the more to kill him, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. What we see here is this Jesus intentionally provoking these Jewish leaders, purposely provoking them. Remember John, we've said this before, that John, through the life ministry of Jesus, 8 signs. He calls them signs because these miracles that Jesus was performing, they weren't just random acts of kindness and compassion on the individual. They were so much more important than that, because they were signposts, supernatural signposts, pointing to who Jesus actually was and what he ultimately came to accomplish. And as the result of this particular healing, conflict erupts. And it's not by accident. I mean, think about it. Jesus could have healed this man the day before. No problem. Could have waited another day. This guy had been lame for 38 years. He was probably not in much of a hurry. But Jesus specifically and intentionally healed him on the Sabbath. And I believe he was intentionally provoking the Jews. He was intentionally creating a chaos and a provocation here. The question is why? Why would Jesus stir the pot? Why would Jesus do something intentionally to create this conflict? And of course, we know Jesus didn't do anything without intention. There was a purpose behind his choice to heal this man on the Sabbath. And as we, go through the Gospels, we see that this happens a number of times where Jesus chooses to do a miracle on the Sabbath to provoke the Jewish leaders. In answering this question, I want to offer from these 3 verses 3 answers to that. These were 3 divine, intentional, kingdom reasons and purposes that Jesus brought this provocation. So, verse 16, I think we see the first one here. So, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. The first reason, the first purpose Jesus had in this provocation was to unmask the hollowness of their religiousness, to unmask the hollowness of their holiness. The core exposure of this first point, you could just say it this way: the core exposure was a hollow religion that Jesus was poking holes in. He was addressing something, he was bringing something to the surface intentionally. Now, imagine how foolish this made them look, that this miraculous healing took place. This man who was delivered from 38 years of being crippled, and they were concerned about their rule being broken. We talked, I think last week, I used this illustration. It would be kind of like you have a neighbor and they've been bedridden for 40 years. And then early one morning, you hear the lawnmower going off at 6 a.m. And you go out there and you're kind of irritated and angry, and you look out and it's your neighbor and he's mowing the lawn. And all you can say to him is like, "Why are you mowing so early?" You're complaining to him like he's waking you up. He's disturbing you. You're breaking the rules of the neighborhood. No one mows their lawn at 6 a.m. Instead of just being like, "Dude, what happened? How is it that you're walking and mowing?" And how did the Jews get to such a point that they missed the obvious miraculous for the sake of their perceived regulation or interpretation of the law? They were so deeply invested in religious control that they completely bypassed the compassion of the miracle that just took place. But let's consider the question: did Jesus indeed ask this man to violate the Sabbath by asking him to get up and to carry his mattress on the Sabbath? And did Jesus violate the Sabbath by healing this man? Let's go back to the Sabbath. Of course, it's the 4th commandment given in the 10 commandments. When God said, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You shall not do any work on it. The Lord who made the heavens and earth, he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." What did God mean by work? That became the issue. that the Jews were obsessed with defining. Going back to the beginning of the Second Temple period, you remember after Israel was drug away to Babylon and the Assyrians attacked Jerusalem, and then Ezra and Nehemiah were sent back to begin restoring the wall and the temple. That marked the beginning of the rebuilding of the Second Temple period that was eventually completed by Herod. But this period that was over 400 years before Christ. During that time, that Second Temple period is where the Pharisees they originated. There were no Pharisees before the Second Temple period. But the religious structure of the teachers of the law and the whole religious system got developed during that Second Temple period. Well, it was during this time they began to interpret the law and add details of how to follow the law, rabbinic prohibitions. Actually, it's called the Shabbat, and for the Sabbath law itself, they had 39 different categories of how to interpret what God meant by don't do work on this day. And it was this way. They saw the law as holy. God said, you shall not violate the Sabbath. And so what they did was they started building these little fences around that law so that you can't even get close to violating the law. We want to make sure, like if God says, do not touch that table, hey, we're going to build a wall around, you can't even get close to that table. Because if you do, you're violating the law. So we're going to make it so safe. We're going to build these little fences. And with the Sabbath law, they built like 39 little fences around the Sabbath, so you can't even get close to violating it. The problem is that over this period of time, over the hundreds of years by the time of Christ, these little fences had become equal in their authority, equal to God's intentional or initial word. They became equal with the law of God themselves. So if you broke one of their rules, one of their traditions, it was considered you're now breaking God's law. And it just got convoluted. So the answer to the question, did Jesus cause this man to violate the Sabbath by having him get up and carrying his mat on Sabbath day? Did he break the Sabbath? No, of course not. But he did break their regulations. He did break their interpretation of keeping the Sabbath. And by the time of Christ, the traditions, the oral law, the oral traditions, the rules, the regulations had got so cemented in with how they viewed the law that they were just, it's as if you are committing a crime against God's law by violating one of their stipulations of what you can do. And it got to the point, literally, within these 39 categories, it addressed things like on the Sabbath, you could not rearrange your furniture. It actually came down to you could not clip your fingernails. It looks absurd to us, but it was this obsession with building these fences around not violating the Sabbath. You could carry something, but it could not weigh more than a dry fig. There are so many examples. Really, it became absurd. So Jesus, of course, tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, I did not come to abolish the law. I didn't come to break the law. I came to fulfill the law. God had intended the Sabbath to be a gift to his people. That was God's purpose and intention. For actually, all of the law was meant for good. It was meant to be a gift to his people, to create a moral structure by which people could live and thrive and enjoy a healthy relationship with each other and benefit each other and deal with each other properly and justly. But the Sabbath law specifically was meant to be a gift. It was meant to be a day in the week when you stopped the normal everyday labor of your job and of the things that you had to do. And it was like giving God's people permission. You don't have to do this every day. Hey, one day, wake up, take a breath. It's a time of rest. It's a time to rejuvenate, be refreshed spiritually, physically, mentally. Just take a break. Stop the usual routine of your jobs and of the things that you labor at. It was meant to be a blessing. It was meant to be a time of rest and rejuvenation. But what God meant to be a blessing, they turned into a burden, a terrible a burden. Matthew 23, verse 4, Jesus said, they crush people with unbearable religious demands and never have lifted a finger to ease that burden. Jesus became so angry at this religious system of what they turned God's gift into. They took what was supposed to be a blessing and they made it into a burden. In Acts 15:10, Paul said it was like placing a yoke. In fact, he rebuked the Jews who were trying to get the Gentile Christians to fulfill these rules and regulations. And he said, why are you putting on their necks a yoke of burden that even we and our ancestors couldn't bear? It's cruel. And what God meant to be rejuvenating to his people, they made a weapon of condemnation. They made it an opportunity to be for people to be condemned and to judge, just like this man. That's how they got to the point where their religious system and regulations became so powerful and so deeply entrenched in their thinking and their worldview, that they missed the obvious mercy and compassion of a miracle that took place in healing this guy. And all they could see is, yeah, but he broke the law. He broke the rule. He broke our tradition. Jesus said in Mark 2:27 regarding what the Sabbath was meant for. He said, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And Jesus in Mark 7:13 said this. He says, you have nullified the word of God by your traditions that you have handed down. You've actually negated God's redemptive intent and purposes of what he wants to bring his people into and experience in the relationship with him by adding all these burdens. You've completely missed the point here. And now you're even causing people who would have otherwise come in and experienced God's blessing. Now they're cursing God in their hearts because of the burden that's been put upon them, because they see God as this cruel taskmaster, this unforgiving, uncompassionate God. And by the time of Christ, they were so infected with this severe legalism that they lost sight of God's heart, that they could actually condemn this man who was healed. An act of mercy, an act of grace. What more perfect day could there be than the Sabbath to see a man's lifelong burden being lifted? That was the crazy part. What better day to see a miracle of God in somebody's life than it was for the Sabbath? The day that was meant to lift off burdens and to bring new life and regenerate and refresh someone's life, than to take a lifelong burden off of them. It was the perfect day for Jesus to heal. But because of the corruption that had infected the religious system of the Jews by the time of Christ, it was upside down. That's why Jesus had so little patience with them. That's why Jesus was purposefully going into conflict with them. That's why he purposely, I'm going to heal this man on the Sabbath for the purpose, exposing and uncovering the emptiness and the hollowness of what you call holiness, of your religious system. A religious system is always big on control. It's rules over relationship. It's traditions over actual transformation. It obscures grace for the sake of, let's make sure we keep observing the rules. It exchanges, really, here's the tragedy, exchanges the freedom of the Spirit for a burden of the letter of the law. It's more important you fulfill the letter of the law than you experience the freedom that the Spirit of God is wanting to produce in people's lives. There's nothing lawless about this. Jesus didn't come to do away with the law. He came to reestablish what the law was for. He came as the interpreter of the law that he gave his own people. He is the lawgiver, and he's the one who gets to define what the heart of this law was. My Father meant this law to be a blessing to my people, and you've made it a burden, to the point where you're condemning a man for being healed on the Sabbath. The absurdity. And this is what Jesus was exposing. He was unmasking this hypocrisy and corruption this poisonous ideology that had crept in to the Jewish religious structure. So I believe that's like the first, verse 16 that gives us the first clue of why Jesus was so purposefully provoking in this moment, why he decided, I'm going to heal this man on the Sabbath and I'm going to create this conflict because I want to, first of all, I want to expose the hypocrisy and the shallowness and the hollowness, the emptiness of their religious practice. Second, verse 17 says, in his defense, Jesus said, my Father is always at work to this to this very day, and I too am working. The second reason why he was intentionally provoking is he was revealing his divine authority. He was revealing his divine authority. Here's the core claim. The core claim is the Son works. The Son works as the Father works. The core claim of Jesus is me and my Father are one. I only do what I see the Father doing. I only speak the words I hear the Father speaking. And Jesus' defense before these Jewish leaders is not a denial. In fact, he's taking it up a notch. He's escalating it to a kind of a rather breathtaking assertion. I'm co-equal with God. He didn't get into arguing, well, you guys have really misunderstood the law of Sabbath. You've misunderstood God's intention. Other times in the Gospels, he has more of that conversation because it happens over and over again. But here in this instant, and by the way, this verse 17, this begins the longest, most intricate defense that Jesus has of declaring his divinity, his oneness with the Father that we have going through the rest of the chapter. That's why I only want to take 3 verses because Jesus gets into some really deep waters, some important, profound waters he's about to have. But here, his claim is the Son works as the Father works. I'm in harmony with God. I'm co-equal with God. And the work that my Father does has not stopped. It transcends the Sabbath. And so I continue working works that transcend the Sabbath, not in violation to the Sabbath. Going back to Genesis chapter 2 concerning creation, it says God rested on the 6th day. He created the heavens and the earth and all that's therein after 6 days. And it says on the 7th day, he rested. He rested from creating the heavens and the earth. But we know that God did not stop working, for God continues to sustain life. God continues to renew life. Psalm 145, verse 16. Lord, you open your hand and you satisfy the desire of every living thing. Jesus talked about, not a sparrow falls without his Father seeing it. He takes care of, he clothes the flowers of the field. He makes sure the birds have something to eat. God is not inactive. God is not sitting on the couch, watching Netflix. He is actively sustaining life. He is deeply connected with his creation in providing and sustaining and refreshing and renewing life. And then in Hebrews 1:3, it says the same thing of Jesus. It says, Jesus, he sustains all things by the power of his word. Jesus himself, co-creator, co-equal with the Father, is literally sustaining our universe and sustaining life on a daily basis by the power of his word. Jesus is saying, hey, my Father hasn't stopped working. He's continuing to renew life and to provide and sustain life, and so am I. And of course, Jesus' claim was just enraging them. But he's saying, listen, I am with my Father, the divine sustainer of life. I'm the giver of life. I'm the sustainer of life. And I continue doing those works, even on the Sabbath. Verse 19, which we'll cover next week, Jesus will say this, I tell you the truth, the Son cannot do anything by himself, but only does what he sees the Father doing. Whatever the Father does, the Son does also. This is just blatant, full on. Anybody who questions, did Jesus ever claim to be God? Every chapter in the Gospel of John is a vivid and bold evidence that Jesus not only knew he was God, but he continued to proclaim it over and over and over again. And this is perhaps one of the most bold times he's doing it. He's saying, me and God the Father, we have the identical nature. What makes God tick It's what makes me tick. How God feels about this is how I feel about it. What God is doing, my Father, me as God the Son, I'm also doing. The things that my Father is saying are the things that I am saying. That's why Jesus could say, I and the Father are one. That's how he could say to Philip, he who has seen me has seen the Father. You can't separate us. He heals bodies. He forgives sins. He delivers from bondages. He raises people from the dead. He is the Lord of Sabbath. He is the Lord of this day. The one that you are charging with blasphemy is himself God. The one that you're charging with violating the Sabbath, he himself is the Lord of Sabbath. That's what he says to us in Gospel of Mark chapter 2. He said, I am the Lord of Sabbath. Literally those words. What a claim. I am the Lord of Sabbath. I am the Sabbath giver. I am the Sabbath definer. I'm the Sabbath fulfiller, rescuing people from corruption and turning them from what was meant to be a blessing into an unbearable burden. I have come to reestablish God's purpose for Sabbath until the completeness of redemption has come. Not one jot, not one tittle, not one letter, not one word will disappear from the law. I didn't come to abolish the law. I didn't come to change the law. I came to fulfill the law, and it will be fulfilled until everything has been made complete. So Jesus deliberately on Sabbath, ripping off the disguise of the religious pretense. He's unmasking the system that has grown so corrupt and so off the track that they're actually missing the very compassion of God upon an individual. And you know, one of the things we have to understand is, listen, however these men started out and wherever they wound up, possibly not the same thing. And you and I, as the church today, as Christians, we are not above having our own Christianity move into a place where it becomes corrupted over time, where we begin to adopt things, traditions, rules, regulations, and somehow over time, those displace the original intent of God. Our Christianity can be, I mean, we see it in the church. And it's not even about the church, which we see it. We see it in denominations. They start off with a simplicity of reaching people for Jesus. And then over time, it becomes this big mechanical machine of, well, we don't take communion like that. We take communion like this. And after generations, this mechanical religiousness becomes as important as the gospel itself. And then you begin to lose sight of God's heart. His heart is to reach people. His heart is to have compassion on people, to bring them into the salvation that Jesus accomplished on the cross. And we start putting all these fences around the gospel, and people can't even get to the gospel. I mean, let me just give you one personal experience. Maybe we've all got these. And this is not to single out a particular church, but this was my personal experience when I was in my mid-20s and I was in East Texas. I was going to a little church in Van. If you look up Van, Texas, it is a small town. Maybe they got a stoplight now. A little country church, Assemblies of God. You were not allowed in the sanctuary on Sunday without either wearing a tie or a dress. If you showed up barefoot or in shorts or jeans, you were not allowed to enter the sanctuary on a Sunday morning. When you enter the sanctuary, you are not allowed to speak. Now, all these things we can find reasons they got put into place. You can find reasons that probably justified at a point of them going, hey, we need to create a culture here of respect and honor for the Lord. But in doing that, in holding to that so strongly, those rules and regulations became as equal as, or even more authoritative than the reason why we're getting together. And it puts fences that keep people from entering the sanctuary into experiencing God. You know, couldn't use stringed instruments, drums, guitars, none of that. And listen, most of these people I went to church with, they loved God. They really did. And even Bob Probert, who was the pastor there, lovely man. But there was a generational culture that had been built and so thick and so layered. And it can happen in any denomination. It can happen in any church that begins to elevate their customs of this is how we do things. And the problem is not the customs. The problem is, do those customs ever get to the point where they're actually building a fence and they're becoming a barrier to people, making people unwelcomed, and making people, keeping them from having access to God. So the second reason why Jesus provoked these men was to uncover the hollowness of their religiousness and to reveal his divine authority. Because this, listen, if Christianity is about anything, it's about who Jesus is. If you miss who Jesus is, you've missed the whole ball of wax. Jesus provoked them to reveal with perfect clarity who he was and why he was doing the things he was doing, and that he possessed equal authority with his Father. And that brings us to the third reason he provoked them, because it's all bringing us to this. He provoked them into a decisive choice about his identity. He was forcing them into an inescapable decision they had to make. Will they believe him or will they reject him? Verse 18, for this reason they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but now he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. The first point, the core exposure was hollow religion. The second point, the core claim was the Son works as the Father works. And the third point is the core intent of this confrontation was to push them into a corner of an inescapable dilemma that they had to decide. Is he who he says he is, or is he not? Will we believe him, or will we reject him? And both have massive eternal implications. Who do you say I am?